The morning sun cast long shadows across Fifth Avenue as Margaret Chen slowly made her way down the busy sidewalk. Her worn leather purse hung from her shoulder, and she gripped her wooden cane a little tighter as she approached the gleaming storefront of Prestige Jewelers. The gold letters sparkled in the sunlight, and the window displays showed off diamonds that caught the light like tiny stars. Margaret paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath. She hadn't been to this particular store in 6 months. Her hip surgery had kept her at home, resting and recovering, while her business continued without her daily presence. Now at 72, she was finally well enough to venture out and see how things were going. She pushed open the heavy glass door, and a soft chime announced her arrival. The cool air conditioning was a welcome relief from the summer heat outside. Margaret looked around, taking in the familiar sights of polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and glass cases filled with precious jewelry. The store buzzed with quiet activity as well-dressed customers moved from display to display, examining rings, necklaces, and watches. The scent of expensive perfume and leather filled the air. Margaret noticed several customers dressed in designer clothes, their jewelry clearly worth more than most people's cars. She glanced down at her own outfit, a comfortable navy cardigan that had belonged to her late husband Robert, sensible walking shoes, and a simple cotton dress. She had never been one for flashy clothing, even when she could afford the finest things money could buy. Near the center of the store, a young couple was looking at engagement rings. The woman's eyes sparkled almost as brightly as the diamonds she was trying on, while her boyfriend watched nervously, probably calculating whether he could afford the monthly payments. Margaret smiled softly, remembering when she and Robert had been in that same position 50 years ago, scraping together every penny for a simple gold band. At the far end of the store, she could see the premium jewelry section. That's where she wanted to go. Next month would mark her 50th wedding anniversary, 50 years since Robert had slipped that simple ring onto her finger. Though he had passed away 3 years ago, she still wanted to honor their anniversary in some way. Maybe a special ring to wear alongside her original wedding band, something that would remind her of all the beautiful years they had shared together. Margaret made her way slowly across the store, her cane tapping softly against the marble floor. She passed a display of pearl necklaces, each one perfectly arranged on black velvet. The prices made her chuckle quietly to herself. When she and Robert had started this business 45 years ago, they never could have imagined selling jewelry worth tens of thousands of dollars. As she walked, Margaret observed the salespeople at work. There was a young woman with short blonde hair helping an elderly gentleman pick out a watch for his grandson. Her patience was evident as she explained the different features, never once making him feel rushed or unwelcome. Margaret made a mental note. This employee was clearly someone who understood good customer service. At another counter, a middle-aged salesman was showing a mother and daughter various bracelet options for the daughter's graduation gift. He listened carefully to what they wanted and stayed within their budget, never trying to push them toward more expensive items. Margaret nodded approvingly. These were the kind of employees who made her proud. But as she approached the premium jewelry section, she noticed a different atmosphere. A tall young man with perfectly styled hair and an expensive suit was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. His name tag read Brandon Wells, and he had the confident air of someone who thought quite highly of himself. He barely looked up when other customers passed by, clearly more interested in whatever was on his screen than in helping anyone. Margaret reached the counter where the anniversary rings were displayed. Each one was a work of art, with intricate settings and stones that seemed to capture and reflect every bit of light in the store. She leaned forward slightly, using her cane for support, and peered at the beautiful pieces through the glass. One ring in particular caught her attention. It was elegant, but not too flashy, with a classic design that reminded her of the style that was popular when she and Robert first got married. The center stone was a modest but beautiful diamond, surrounded by smaller stones that formed a delicate pattern. It was exactly the kind of ring she had envisioned, something that would honor their long marriage without being overly showy. She stood there for several minutes, admiring the craftsmanship and imagining how it would look on her finger. The ring represented so much more than just a piece of jewelry. It would be a symbol of 5 decades of love, partnership, challenges overcome together, and memories that would last forever. The store continued to bustle around her. She heard the soft murmur of conversations, the gentle ding of the cash register, and the occasional laugh from satisfied customers. This was the world she had helped create, the business she and Robert had built from nothing into something they could be proud of. Margaret thought back to the early days, when they had worked 18-hour days in a tiny shop that was barely bigger than a closet. Robert would repair watches and resize rings while she handled the customers and kept the books. They had dreams of expanding, of creating something bigger, but they never imagined it would grow into a chain of 12 stores across 3 states. Those had been difficult years, but also wonderful ones. They were young and in love, willing to work hard and sacrifice for their shared dream. Every small success felt like a major victory. Their first $1,000 day, their first month without losing money, the day they were finally able to hire their first employee. Now, standing in this beautiful store that represented the fulfillment of those early dreams, Margaret felt a mix of pride and nostalgia. Robert would have been amazed to see how far they had come. He always said that success wasn't measured by how much money you made, but by how you treated people along the way. Margaret shifted her weight slightly, her hip reminding her that she was still recovering. The surgery had been successful, but at her age, healing took time. She had spent months in physical therapy, slowly building back her strength and mobility. During that time, she had relied on her trusted managers to run the day-to-day operations of the business. She wondered how things had been going in her absence. Were her employees maintaining the high standards she had always insisted upon? Were customers being treated with the respect and dignity that every person deserved, regardless of how much money they had to spend? Looking around the store now, everything seemed to be running smoothly. The displays were well maintained, the staff appeared professional, and customers seemed satisfied. But Margaret knew that the real test of a business wasn't what you saw on the surface. It was how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. She continued to study the anniversary ring, already imagining the story she would tell her grandchildren about why she chose it. It would become part of the family history, passed down along with the tales of how she and their grandfather had built this business together, through hard work, determination, and always treating people right. Brandon Wells glanced up from his phone and noticed the elderly woman standing at his counter. She was leaning on a cane, wearing what looked like second-hand clothes and staring intently at the expensive anniversary rings. He sighed quietly and looked back at his screen, hoping she would move along to a different section of the store. He had been working at Prestige Jewelers for only 3 months, but he already considered himself one of their top salespeople. Just last week, he had sold a $20,000 watch to a tech executive, earning himself a nice commission check. Brandon prided himself on being able to spot serious customers from across the room. He could tell who had money and who was just wasting his time. This old lady was clearly a time waster. Her cardigan looked like something from a thrift store. Her shoes were practical rather than fashionable, and she was probably just looking at pretty things she could never afford. Brandon had dealt with plenty of window shoppers before, and he had learned not to waste his energy on people who weren't going to buy anything. Margaret cleared her throat softly and looked up at Brandon. "Excuse me," she said politely. "Could I please look at some of these anniversary rings?" Brandon didn't immediately look up from his phone. He was in the middle of texting his girlfriend about their weekend plans, and this interruption was annoying. After a few seconds, he glanced at Margaret with barely concealed irritation. "Which ones?" he asked curtly, not bothering to put his phone away. "The one in the center there," Margaret said, pointing to the ring that had caught her attention. "The one with the diamond surrounded by the smaller stones." Brandon followed her gaze and nearly rolled his eyes. Of course she would pick one of the most expensive pieces in the case. That particular ring was priced at $15,000. Far more than this woman could possibly afford. He had seen this pattern before. People with no money always seemed drawn to the most expensive items. "That one starts at $15,000, Brandon said dismissively, hoping the price would send her away. "It's part of our premium collection." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "It's beautiful work," she said. "Could I see it a little closer?" This time Brandon did roll his eyes, though he tried to be subtle about it. He looked around the store, hoping to spot a more promising customer who might actually buy something. Near the front entrance, he noticed a well-dressed businessman examining some luxury watches. That was the kind of customer Brandon wanted to focus on. "Look, ma'am," Brandon said, his tone becoming more dismissive. "That's a very expensive piece. Are you sure you wouldn't be more interested in something from our more affordable collection?" He gestured vaguely toward the other side of the store where the less expensive jewelry was displayed. Margaret's expression remained patient and kind, despite Brandon's obvious rudeness. "I understand it's expensive," she said gently. "I was hoping to see it up close to get a better sense of the craftsmanship." Brandon glanced at his phone again, checking the time. He had plans to meet friends for lunch in an hour, and he didn't want to spend his remaining time dealing with someone who clearly couldn't afford to shop here. The old woman seemed nice enough, but nice didn't pay his bills or contribute to his commission checks. "The thing is," Brandon said, leaning back against the counter, "I usually only take pieces out of the case for serious buyers. These rings are very valuable, and we have insurance considerations." This wasn't entirely true. The store policy was to show jewelry to any customer who asked, but Brandon hoped it would encourage the woman to leave. Margaret tilted her head slightly, still maintaining her gentle demeanor. "I understand your concerns," she said. "Perhaps we could discuss payment options. I was thinking about making this a special purchase for my 50th wedding anniversary." Brandon barely suppressed a snort of laughter. 50 years of marriage, and now she wanted to buy an expensive ring? It seemed more likely that she was living in some kind of fantasy, dreaming about jewelry she could never afford. He had encountered customers like this before, usually older people who seemed disconnected from financial reality. "Ma'am, I appreciate your interest," Brandon said, his patience wearing thin, "but our payment plans require substantial down payments and credit approval. For a ring like this, you'd be looking at putting down at least $5,000 today." He watched Margaret's face carefully, waiting for the moment when reality would set in, and she would realize she was out of her league. Instead, she simply nodded and continued to study the ring through the glass case. "The setting is really quite lovely," Margaret said, apparently unaffected by Brandon's attempts to discourage her. "It reminds me of styles that were popular in the 70s. Brandon's phone buzzed with another text message, and he glanced at it while Margaret continued talking. His girlfriend was asking about dinner plans, and he found himself more interested in that conversation than in dealing with this persistent customer. "Mm-hmm," Brandon said absently, typing a quick response to his girlfriend. "Yeah, it's a classic style." Margaret waited patiently for Brandon to finish with his phone before continuing. "I notice you have other anniversary rings as well. Are they all similar in quality?" This question finally got Brandon's full attention, but not in a good way. The woman was clearly planning to keep him occupied with more requests, probably wanting to see multiple rings that she had no intention of buying. He had experienced this before with customers who seemed to enjoy the fantasy of shopping for expensive jewelry, even when they knew they couldn't afford it. "Look," Brandon said, putting his phone face down on the counter with a slight slam. "I'm going to be honest with you. These rings are really designed for customers with significant disposable income. Maybe you'd be more comfortable looking at our selection over there." He pointed toward the opposite end of the store, where the jewelry was considerably less expensive. Margaret followed his gesture but didn't move away from the counter. "I appreciate your concern for my budget," she said quietly, "but I was rather hoping to see this particular ring. It really does remind me of something my late husband would have chosen." The mention of her late husband gave Brandon pause for just a moment. He could see genuine emotion in the woman's eyes, and he almost felt bad about his dismissive attitude. Almost. But sympathy didn't change the facts. She clearly couldn't afford what she was looking at, and he was wasting time that could be better spent with paying customers. Brandon glanced around the store again and noticed that the businessman near the entrance was now talking to Lisa, one of the other salespeople. That commission was going to go to her instead of him, all because he was stuck dealing with this woman who couldn't take a hint. "Ma'am," Brandon said, his tone becoming more firm, "I really think you'd be happier looking at something more in your price range. We have some lovely pieces that would be much more appropriate for your situation." Margaret's eyes showed a flicker of hurt at his words, but she maintained her composure. "What exactly do you think my situation is?" she asked quietly. Brandon realized he had probably said too much, but he was too frustrated to back down now. "I'm just trying to be realistic," he said. "I can tell when someone is seriously shopping versus just looking at pretty things. And honestly, I need to focus on customers who are actually going to make purchases today." The words hung in the air between them, and Brandon immediately regretted being so blunt. But it was too late to take them back, and he wasn't sure he would even if he could. Sometimes people needed to hear the truth even if it wasn't what they wanted to hear. Margaret stood quietly for a long moment, processing Brandon's words. Around them, the store continued its normal operations. Other customers browsing, salespeople helping with purchases, the soft sound of classical music playing in the background. But at Brandon's counter, the atmosphere had become tense and uncomfortable. "I see," Margaret said finally, her voice still calm despite the obvious slight. "And you've determined that I'm not a serious customer based on what exactly?" Brandon felt trapped by his own words, but decided to double down rather than admit he might have made a mistake. "Experience," he said simply. "I've learned to read people pretty well in this business." Margaret took a slow, deep breath and looked directly at Brandon. Despite the hurt she felt from his dismissive treatment, she maintained her dignified composure. 50 years of running a business had taught her that how people treated others in difficult moments revealed their true character. "I understand you think you can read people," Margaret said gently, "but perhaps you might reconsider your assessment. I'm genuinely interested in purchasing an anniversary ring to commemorate 50 years of marriage." Brandon shifted uncomfortably, but held his ground. He glanced at his watch, noting that his lunch break was approaching and this conversation was taking far longer than he had intended. The old woman seemed determined to continue this charade, but he had no intention of playing along much longer. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Brandon said, his tone becoming more condescending, 50 years of marriage is wonderful, but that doesn't change the financial reality of a $15,000 purchase. "These aren't impulse buys," Margaret nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right that it's not an impulse buy," she agreed. "It's something I've been thinking about for quite some time. In fact, I've been considering it for months while I was recovering from surgery." "Surgery?" Brandon asked, though his tone suggested he was more annoyed than concerned. "Hip replacement," Margaret explained, shifting her weight slightly on her cane. "It's kept me away from my usual activities for quite a while. But now that I'm mobile again, I wanted to do something special to mark this anniversary. My husband passed away 3 years ago, but I still like to honor the date." For a brief moment, Brandon felt a twinge of sympathy. The woman's story was touching, and he could see genuine sadness in her eyes when she mentioned her late husband. But sympathy didn't change the economic reality of the situation. He had bills to pay and sales goals to meet. "That's very sweet," Brandon said, his tone softening slightly but remaining dismissive. "But honestly, wouldn't your money be better spent on something more practical? At your age, with medical expenses and everything?" Margaret's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, but her voice remained steady. "At my age?" she repeated quietly. Brandon realized he had crossed another line, but he was in too deep to back out now. "I just mean that $15,000 is a lot of money for anyone, especially someone on a fixed income. Wouldn't you rather put that towards something you actually need? And what makes you think I'm on a fixed income?" Margaret asked. Brandon gestured vaguely at her appearance, the worn cardigan, the practical shoes, the simple purse. "I mean, it's pretty obvious," he said. "Look, I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just being realistic about what makes financial sense." Margaret studied Brandon's face carefully. She could see that he genuinely believed he was being helpful, even as he insulted her with every word. It was a fascinating and disturbing glimpse into how some people viewed the elderly, making assumptions based on nothing more than appearance and age. "So you believe that how I'm dressed today tells you everything you need to know about my financial situation?" Margaret asked. "Pretty much," Brandon said, gaining confidence as he warmed to his theme. "I mean, people who can afford $15,000 jewelry usually look the part. They dress well, carry designer bags, wear expensive watches. It's just common sense." Margaret glanced down at her simple outfit. The cardigan had indeed belonged to Robert. She wore it sometimes because it still smelled faintly of his cologne and made her feel close to him. The shoes were comfortable and practical because her hip was still healing. The purse was leather but not flashy, chosen for its functionality rather than its brand name. "I see," Margaret said quietly. "And in your experience, people who dress expensively are always able to afford expensive purchases?" "Usually, yeah," Brandon said, pleased that she seemed to be understanding his point. "Rich people look like rich people. It's not complicated." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting perspective, she said. Tell me, have you ever encountered someone who might dress simply by choice rather than necessity? Brandon shrugged. I guess it's possible, but why would anyone do that? If you have money, why not show it off? Perhaps because they value other things more than appearance, Margaret suggested. Or maybe they've learned that true worth isn't measured by clothing brands or jewelry collections. Brandon looked at her skeptically. That sounds nice in theory, he said. But in the real world, people judge you by how you present yourself. If you want to be taken seriously, you have to look the part. And yet here I am asking to be taken seriously despite not looking the part, Margaret pointed out gently. Brandon's expression hardened. He was tired of this philosophical discussion and ready to end the conversation. Look, lady, I've been nice about this, but I need to be straight with you. You're wasting my time. I have real customers to help, people who can actually afford to shop here. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral. Around them, other customers were beginning to notice the tension at Brandon's counter. A young woman browsing earrings nearby glanced over with concern, while an older gentleman examining watches looked frankly appalled by Brandon's behavior. Real customers, Margaret repeated softly. I see. Yeah, real customers, Brandon said, emboldened by what he perceived as her acceptance of his position. People who aren't just here to waste time looking at things they can't afford. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, processing not just Brandon's words but his entire attitude. In 45 years of building her business, she had always insisted that every customer be treated with dignity and respect. It didn't matter if they bought a $10 chain or a $10,000 necklace. Everyone deserved courtesy and consideration. You know, Margaret said finally, I've been shopping in jewelry stores for a very long time. I've seen all kinds of salespeople and all kinds of customer service, but I don't think I've ever encountered anyone quite like you. Brandon took this as a compliment. Yeah, well, I'm pretty good at cutting through the nonsense and getting to the point, he said proudly. Some people appreciate honesty. Honesty, Margaret mused. Is that what you call this? Absolutely, Brandon said. I'm being honest about the situation. You want to look at expensive jewelry you can't afford, and I'm being honest that it's a waste of both our time. Margaret shifted her weight on her cane and looked around the store. She could see Lisa helping the businessman with watches, patiently answering his questions and treating him with professional courtesy. At another counter, a young salesperson was showing a teenage girl and her mother various graduation gift options, never once suggesting that they couldn't afford what they were looking at. Tell me, Brandon, Margaret said, reading his name tag. How long have you been working in retail? 3 months here, but I worked at an electronics store before that, Brandon said, wondering where this was going. Why? Just curious about your experience with customer service, Margaret said. Have you received any training on how to treat customers? Brandon laughed. Lady, I don't need training to know how to do my job. I'm a natural salesperson. Some people have it, some people don't. I see, Margaret said. And part of being a natural salesperson involves deciding who deserves good service and who doesn't. It involves not wasting time on people who aren't going to buy anything, Brandon said defensively. That's just good business sense. Margaret nodded slowly. Good business sense, she repeated. That's one way to look at it, I suppose. The conversation was attracting more attention now. Lisa glanced over from her counter with a worried expression, and the businessman she was helping seemed to be listening to Brandon's words with growing disapproval. Other customers were starting to whisper among themselves about the scene unfolding at the anniversary ring display. Look, Brandon said, lowering his voice slightly as he noticed the attention they were drawing. Maybe we should just agree to disagree here. You think you want to buy an expensive ring? I think you're being unrealistic. Why don't you go look around some more and think about it? Actually, Margaret said, I was wondering if I might speak to a manager. Brandon's expression changed immediately when Margaret mentioned wanting to speak to a manager. The confident smirk disappeared from his face, replaced by a look of concern mixed with irritation. In his 3 months at the store, he had never had a customer ask for a manager, and he definitely didn't want to deal with that kind of situation now. A manager? Brandon asked, his voice slightly higher than before. Why would you need to speak to a manager? I'm handling your questions just fine. I'd simply like to discuss my shopping experience with someone in authority, Margaret said calmly. It's nothing personal against you, Brandon. But Brandon knew it was personal, and he could feel his carefully constructed confidence beginning to crumble. He glanced around the store nervously, hoping that neither of the managers was currently on the floor. The last thing he needed was some old lady complaining about his customer service, especially when he was still in his probationary period. "Look, Mrs." Brandon paused, realizing he didn't even know her name. "Chen," Margaret supplied quietly. "Mrs. Chen." "Mrs. Chen, listen, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here," Brandon said, attempting to salvage the situation. "Why don't we start over? I'll be happy to show you that anniversary ring you were interested in." Margaret studied his face carefully. The sudden change in his attitude was telling. Clearly, he was worried about facing consequences for his behavior. But his offer felt hollow, motivated by self-preservation rather than genuine desire to provide good service. "That's very kind of you to offer now," Margaret said, "but I think I'd still prefer to speak with a manager." Brandon's jaw tightened. This woman was clearly determined to cause trouble for him, probably hoping to get some kind of compensation or discount by complaining about his service. He had heard about customers who did that, making a big fuss in order to get special treatment. "Fine," Brandon said curtly, "but I should warn you. Our managers are very busy with important customers today. They might not have time to deal with complaints." The way he said the word complaints made it sound like something distasteful and unreasonable. Margaret noticed how he emphasized important customers, making it clear that he still didn't consider her to be in that category. "I understand they're busy," Margaret said patiently. "I'm willing to wait." Brandon looked around the store again, and his heart sank when he spotted David Kim, one of the assistant managers, emerging from the back office with some paperwork in his hands. David was known for taking customer service very seriously, and he would definitely want to hear about any complaints. "I'll go get him," Brandon said reluctantly. "But this is really unnecessary. We can work this out between us." "I appreciate your concern," Margaret said, "but I'd still like to speak with him." Brandon walked over to David, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to present the situation in the best possible light. Maybe he could frame it as a misunderstanding, or suggest that the customer was being unreasonable. "Hey, David," Brandon said, trying to sound casual. "There's a customer over there who wants to talk to a manager. It's not a big deal, just some confusion about pricing." David looked past Brandon toward Margaret, who was standing patiently at the counter. "Confusion about pricing?" David asked. "What kind of confusion?" "She was looking at one of the expensive anniversary rings, and I explained that it might be out of her price range," Brandon said, carefully editing the truth. "She seemed upset about that." David's expression grew serious. "You told a customer that something was out of their price range?" "Well, yeah, but I was just trying to be helpful," Brandon said quickly. "I mean, she's an elderly lady on a fixed income. I didn't want her to get in over her head financially." "Brandon," David said slowly, "please tell me you didn't make assumptions about a customer's ability to pay based on their appearance." Brandon could see where this was heading, and he didn't like it. "It wasn't like that," he protested. "I was just being realistic about the situation." David closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to maintain his patience. "Go back to your counter," he said quietly. "I'll handle this." As David walked toward Margaret, Brandon followed a few steps behind, his stomach churning with anxiety. He watched as David approached the elderly woman with a professional smile and respectful demeanor. "Good morning, ma'am," David said warmly. "I'm David Kim, one of the assistant managers here. I understand you wanted to speak with someone in management?" "Yes, thank you," Margaret said, extending her hand for a polite handshake. "I'm Margaret Chen. I was hoping to discuss my experience shopping here today." David shook her hand respectfully. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. I apologize if there's been any issue with your service. Would you be comfortable discussing it here, or would you prefer to speak privately in my office?" "Here is fine," Margaret said. "I don't need privacy for what I have to say." David nodded and glanced briefly at Brandon, who was hovering nearby, trying to look busy while obviously listening to every word. "What seems to be the problem?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "I came in today hoping to look at anniversary rings. It's going to be my 50th wedding anniversary next month, and I wanted to find something special to commemorate the occasion." 50 years, David said with genuine admiration. "That's wonderful. Congratulations." "Thank you," Margaret said with a small smile. My husband passed away 3 years ago, but I still like to honor our anniversary date. I saw a beautiful ring in this case that caught my attention. David looked at the display of anniversary rings, noting the prices and quality of the pieces. "These are some of our finest pieces," he said. "Did someone help you look at them?" "That's where the problem began," Margaret said gently. "Your employee Brandon made it very clear that he didn't think I could afford to shop here. He refused to show me any jewelry and suggested I would be more comfortable shopping somewhere else." David's face darkened as he looked over at Brandon, who had gone pale. "He refused to show you jewelry?" "He said that people like me usually can't afford rings like these," Margaret explained. "He told me I was wasting his time and that he needed to focus on real customers instead." "Real customers," David repeated, his voice tight with controlled anger. He also made comments about my age and suggested that I was probably on a fixed income and should spend my money on something more practical, Margaret continued. "He seemed to believe that my appearance told him everything he needed to know about my financial situation." David turned to look at Brandon, whose face had gone from pale to red. "Is this accurate?" David asked. Brandon opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. He could see from David's expression that there would be no point in trying to defend his actions. "The damage was done. I was just trying to be helpful," Brandon said weakly. "Helpful," David repeated, the word dripping with disbelief. "You thought it would be helpful to judge a customer's ability to pay based on their appearance and age?" "I didn't mean it like that," Brandon protested. "How exactly did you mean it?" David asked. Brandon realized he had no good answer to that question. Every explanation he could think of would only make him sound worse. He looked at Margaret, hoping to see some sign of forgiveness or understanding, but her expression was unreadable. David turned back to Margaret with a look of profound embarrassment. "Mrs. Chen, I cannot apologize enough for this treatment. This is absolutely not how we train our employees to interact with customers, and it's completely unacceptable." "I understand," Margaret said quietly. "I was hoping this might be a learning opportunity." "It certainly will be," David said, shooting another look at Brandon. "I want you to know that we value every customer who walks through our doors, regardless of how they're dressed or what we think they can afford. That's been our policy since this store opened." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Since the store opened," she repeated. "That's interesting. How long has this location been in business?" "About 12 years now," David said. "It's part of a larger chain that's been around much longer. The original store opened in 1980, I believe." 1980, Margaret said softly. "Yes, that sounds about right." David noticed something odd in her tone but couldn't quite place what it was. "Are you familiar with the company's history?" Margaret smiled mysteriously. "You could say that," she said. "In fact, I think it's time I properly introduced myself." Margaret reached into her simple leather purse and pulled out a business card holder. With deliberate care, she extracted a card and handed it to David. As he read it, his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, complete shock. "Margaret Chen," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Prestige Jewelers." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. David stared at the card, then at Margaret, then back at the card again, as if he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Behind him, Brandon had gone completely white, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. "That's correct," Margaret said calmly. "I'm the owner of this store and the 11 others in our chain." David's hands were actually shaking as he held the business card. "Mrs. Chen, I had no idea. I mean, we weren't expecting—" "I don't usually announce my visits," Margaret explained gently. "I find that I learn much more about how the stores are really operating when people don't know who I am." Brandon felt like the world was spinning around him. This couldn't be happening. The old woman he had dismissed and insulted was the owner of the entire company. The woman he had told to shop somewhere else actually owned the store he was standing in. "Oh my God," Brandon whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Margaret looked at him with what might have been sympathy. "I can see this comes as a surprise to you, Brandon." "Mrs. Chen," David said, his voice filled with horror and embarrassment. "I am so deeply sorry. This is absolutely inexcusable. I take full responsibility for what happened here today." "Thank you, David," Margaret said. "But the responsibility lies with the individual who chose to treat a customer poorly, not with you." She turned to face Brandon directly. The young man looked like he might be sick, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. Margaret had seen this reaction before years ago, when she had caught other employees behaving badly toward customers they deemed unworthy. "Brandon," she said quietly, "I want you to understand something. When my husband Robert and I started this business 45 years ago, we made a promise to each other. We promised that every person who walked through our doors would be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how much money they had or what they looked like." Brandon couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the floor, his mind reeling with the magnitude of his mistake. "We kept that promise through the hard early years, when we were struggling to keep the lights on and every sale mattered," Margaret continued. "We kept it when we expanded to our second store, and our third, and every store after that. It's not just our policy, it's the foundation of who we are as a company." David nodded vigorously. "Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what we teach in our training programs. Which makes me wonder," Margaret said, looking at Brandon again, "how someone could work here for 3 months and still not understand this basic principle." Brandon finally looked up, his eyes filled with panic and regret. "Mrs. Chen, I am so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. I was completely wrong about everything. Please, I need this job. I'll do anything to make this right." Margaret studied his face carefully. She could see genuine remorse there, but also fear for his own situation. It was the same pattern she had seen over the years. People were usually more sorry about getting caught than they were about their actual behavior. "Tell me, Brandon," she said, "what exactly are you sorry about?" Brandon swallowed hard, trying to organize his thoughts. "I'm sorry for judging you based on your appearance. I'm sorry for being rude and dismissive. I'm sorry for not showing you the jewelry you wanted to see. I'm sorry for everything." "Those are the actions you're apologizing for," Margaret said. "But what about the thinking behind those actions? Do you understand why those behaviors were wrong? Or are you just sorry because you got caught?" The question hit Brandon like a physical blow. He realized that she was seeing right through him, recognizing that his apology was driven more by self-preservation than genuine understanding. Brandon started, then stopped. He thought about her question seriously for the first time. I think I was wrong because I assumed I could tell everything about a person just by looking at them, and I was wrong because I decided that some customers deserved better treatment than others." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's closer to the real issue," she said. "But let me ask you this, if I had been exactly who you thought I was, an elderly woman on a limited income who just wanted to look at pretty jewelry, would your behavior have been acceptable then?" Brandon considered this carefully. The honest answer was that until this moment he probably would have said yes. He would have justified his actions by saying he was being realistic and protecting the store's time and resources. But now, faced with the consequences of his thinking, he was beginning to see how wrong that was. "No," he said quietly. "It wouldn't have been acceptable. Every customer deserves respect, regardless of whether they buy anything or not." "Exactly," Margaret said. "Because the person you thought I was deserved the same courtesy and consideration that you would give to anyone else. The problem wasn't that you misjudged my financial situation. The problem was that you thought someone's financial situation gave you the right to treat them poorly." David cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Chen, what would you like us to do about this situation?" Margaret looked around the store, taking in the other customers and employees who had been watching this drama unfold. Some looked shocked. Others seemed fascinated by the turn of events. Lisa, the salesperson who had been helping the businessman earlier, looked particularly concerned about what this might mean for the store's reputation. "Well," Margaret said, "first, I think Brandon and I need to complete the transaction that brought me here in the first place." Both Brandon and David looked confused. "Transaction?" David asked. "I came here to buy an anniversary ring," Margaret explained. "Despite everything that's happened, I still want to make that purchase." She walked back to the display case and pointed to the ring that had originally caught her attention. "This one, I think. The one Brandon was so certain I couldn't afford." Brandon's face went through another series of emotions as the reality of the situation hit him again. Not only was she the owner of the company, but she actually was a customer who could afford the expensive jewelry he had refused to show her. "Brandon," Margaret said, "I'd like you to help me with this purchase. Show me the ring properly, explain its features, And treat me the way you should have treated me from the beginning." "Mrs. Chen," David interjected. "Perhaps it would be better if someone else handled this sale." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Brandon started this interaction, and he's going to finish it correctly. This is part of the learning process." Brandon's hands were still shaking as he unlocked the display case and carefully removed the anniversary ring. This time he held it reverently, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "This is a beautiful piece," he said, his voice much quieter and more respectful than before. "The center stone is a 1-carat diamond, surrounded by smaller diamonds in a classic halo setting. The craftsmanship is exceptional, and it comes with a lifetime warranty." Margaret examined the ring carefully, asking thoughtful questions about the setting and the quality of the stones. Brandon answered each question thoroughly and professionally, showing her a side of his abilities that had been completely absent during their earlier interaction. "It's perfect," Margaret said finally. "Exactly what I was looking for. I'll take it." Brandon processed the sale with meticulous care, double-checking every detail and treating Margaret with the utmost courtesy. When the transaction was complete, Margaret had not only purchased the $15,000 ring, but had also added a matching necklace that complemented it beautifully. "Thank you for your assistance, Brandon," Margaret said as she signed the final paperwork. "This is how every customer should be treated from the moment they walk through our doors." Brandon nodded, his face still flushed with embarrassment and regret. "Yes, ma'am. I understand that now." Margaret turned to David. "I'd like to use this experience as a training opportunity for all of our employees. Sometimes the best lessons come from real situations like this one." "Absolutely," David agreed. "We'll make sure everyone understands what went wrong here and how to avoid similar situations in the future." "As for Brandon," Margaret said, looking at the young man who had caused all this trouble, "I think he's learned a valuable lesson today. The question is whether he'll remember it tomorrow and next week and next month." Brandon looked up hopefully. "Does that mean, am I still employed?" Margaret considered this question carefully. "That depends entirely on you," she said. "You've shown me today that you can provide excellent customer service when you choose to. The question is whether you'll choose to do so consistently, for every customer, regardless of what you think about their appearance or their ability to buy." "I will," Brandon said earnestly. "I promise you I will never treat another customer the way I treated you today." "Good," Margaret said. "Because if you do, you'll be looking for a new job. And more importantly, you'll be failing to live up to the values that built this company." She gathered her purchases and prepared to leave, but before she reached the door, she turned back to address the entire store. All the employees and several customers had gathered to listen. "I want everyone to remember what happened here today," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the store. "We judge people based on appearances all the time, and we're wrong more often than we're right. But even when we're right about someone's circumstances, that doesn't give us permission to treat them with anything less than complete respect and dignity." She paused, making eye contact with several employees. "Our customers trust us with their most precious moments. Engagements, anniversaries, graduations, and celebrations of all kinds. We have the privilege of being part of their joy. That's not something to take lightly." Margaret walked slowly toward the exit, her cane tapping softly on the marble floor. At the door, she turned back one more time. "Oh, and Brandon," she called out, "the next time an elderly person in comfortable clothes asks to see expensive jewelry, remember this day. Remember that you never really know who you're talking to, but more importantly, remember that it shouldn't matter." As the door closed behind her, the store fell into stunned silence. Brandon stood at his counter holding his head in his hands, while David began planning how to turn this painful experience into a teaching moment that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Outside on Fifth Avenue, Margaret Chen smiled to herself as she walked slowly toward her car. The ring box in her purse contained a beautiful piece of jewelry that would help her commemorate 50 years of marriage to the love of her life. But more importantly, she had reminded herself why she had spent 45 years building a business based on treating every person with dignity. Because you never know who might walk through your door, and everyone deserves respect regardless of who they are.